I am Arthur, 28 years old. 8 months ago, my family completely abandoned me on the most important day of my life. While I was standing on my college graduation stage, searching desperately for a single familiar face, my parents were busy buying my golden child brother a brand new Porsche. They humiliated me in front of thousands of people, leaving a row of empty chairs with my last name printed on them. But there is one thing they didn't know. They didn't know that my silent departure from their toxic household was the foundation of a multimillion-dollar real estate empire. And right now, my father is demanding I attend a mandatory family dinner to bail them out of bankruptcy, completely unaware that I am holding the exact legal documents that will systematically destroy their entire financial future. Before I tell you exactly what happened inside that dining room, please hit the like button if you believe that toxic family members eventually get exactly what they deserve. And do not forget to let me know what city or state you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the moment the trap was finally set. I sat in my beat-up Honda outside the house I grew up in, letting the engine hum quietly under my hands. The vibration of the steering wheel was a familiar comfort, a steady rhythm that anchored me to reality. Through the smudged windshield, the suburban Seattle evening was settling into a deep, freezing navy blue. The house looked exactly the same as it did when I was a terrified teenager. It had the perfect manicured lawn, the aggressively trimmed hedges, and that warm amber glow spilling from the expensive dining room windows. It was the kind of neighborhood where people cared more about HOA meetings and property values than they did about their own children. It was a picture-perfect American family home on the outside. But I knew the truth. Homes are just boxes with nice vinyl siding, and the people inside this particular box had taught me long ago that family is nothing more than a biological accident. My phone screen suddenly lit up, casting a harsh, blinding white glare against the dark ceiling of my car cabin. The notification was a text message from my father. It was the exact same message that had violently dragged me out to this neighborhood tonight. I stared at the words glowing on the glass. Family dinner 6 p.m. Important discussion. There was no warmth. No, hello, Arthur. No, how have you been for the last 8 long months? No apologies for the past. It was a sterile corporate summons. It was a command from a man who treated his children like depreciating assets. And the absolute only reason he was texting me now, after nearly a year of absolute dead silence, was because my name had just been printed in massive bold letters right across the front page of the city's largest real estate journal. I slowly turned my head and looked at the passenger seat. Sitting there, illuminated by the faint orange glow of a distant street lamp, was a black, heavily worn leather portfolio. The stitching on the bottom left corner was jagged, thick, and crooked. It was a crude, desperate repair job done by my own freezing hands years ago in an apartment with no heat. But inside that battered piece of cheap leather were the officially recorded documents that would completely dismantle my father's entire legacy. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. The silence in the car was heavier than a funeral, but for the very first time in 28 years, I was not terrified of walking up that concrete path and opening that heavy oak front door. I leaned the back of my head against the worn fabric of the headrest and closed my eyes tightly. The silence in the car was absolute, but my mind was incredibly loud. It was actively dragging me back to the years of quiet, brutal conditioning. The decades of being systematically trained to be entirely invisible. I needed to sit in this driveway and remember the pain. I needed to remember exactly why I was about to do what I was going to do. Because when you grow up as the disposable child, the absolute hardest thing to do is to stop making excuses for the people who break you. I thought the worst was over on my graduation day when I stared at those empty chairs. I was so incredibly wrong. The betrayal ran much deeper than a missed ceremony. It was a lifetime of being treated like a ghost in my own home. A quiet gap filler who was only acknowledged when someone else created a mess that needed to be cleaned up. Tonight, I was not here to clean up their mess. I was here to hand them the bill. In my family, I was always the quiet gap filler. I was the designated survivor in a household that only had room for 1 star. My older brother, Julian, was the golden child. He was the charismatic athlete, the smooth talker, the one who could walk right into a crowded room and demand that all the oxygen belong exclusively to him. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, practically worshipped the ground he walked on. Julian never faced a single real consequence in his entire life. If he wrecked a car in high school, my dad immediately called his lawyer and made the citations completely disappear. If he failed a college prep class, my mother marched into the school, blamed the teacher's incompetence, and threw absurd amounts of money at private tutors who essentially did the homework for him. And then there was me. I was just the steady pair of hands. I was the person who stepped in whenever Julian stepped out. I learned very early on that the only way to survive the crushing weight of that house was to take up as little space as humanly possible. I did not ask for expensive things. I did not complain about wearing Julian's worn-out hand-me-downs. The blatant financial abuse was something my parents expertly wrapped in the manipulative language of family loyalty. I will never forget the day I found out about the college fund. My grandparents had set up equal accounts for both Julian and me. Right before my freshman year of college, the bank sent a statement to the house. I opened it, expecting to see the funds I needed for tuition. The balance was zero. My father had drained my entire college fund. When I confronted him, my voice shaking with panic, he did not even look up from his newspaper. He coldly informed me that Julian needed the money for a highly lucrative business venture that was guaranteed to double our inheritance. The so-called venture failed miserably in less than 3 months. Julian used the remaining cash to buy a speedboat. I was forced to take out predatory student loans and work 3 grueling minimum wage jobs just to pay for my textbooks. The pattern of erasure was relentless. I remember my 21st birthday vividly. I had been saving my meager salary from my graveyard shift at a local diner for 6 straight months. I wanted to buy a professional set of architectural drafting tools. I wanted to be an architect. I desperately wanted to build massive structures that lasted, solid things that could not be easily broken by careless people. I finally had the cash neatly stacked in a white envelope sitting on my bedroom desk. Before I could even put my shoes on to leave the house and go to the art supply store, my father walked directly into my room. He did not knock. He saw the envelope, picked it up without asking, and began thumbing through the crisp bills. "Julian is in a really tight spot right now," my father had said. His tone was terribly casual, exactly as if he were commenting on the rainy Seattle weather. "He is facing a nasty lawsuit from a minor traffic collision he caused. I need to borrow this cash to pay the retainer for his lawyer. You are responsible, Arthur. You can figure it out. Your brother has a good heart. He just needs some time to settle down." He pocketed the money. My money. The money I had literally traded my sleep and my youth to earn. I just stood there and nodded, because nodding was always significantly easier than arguing with a brick wall. That exact same night, we had a mandatory family dinner. I had spent the afternoon baking my own chocolate birthday cake, because my mother said she was too tired to go to the bakery. Julian showed up 2 hours late to dinner, carrying a cheap box of store-bought cookies he clearly grabbed from a gas station on the way over. My mother immediately stood up, kissed his cheek warmly, and told him how incredibly thoughtful he always was. I stood at the end of the dining room table holding the cake server, realizing with absolute clarity that my existence had been entirely erased without anyone in the room even noticing. But the specific memory that still sits like a block of cold metal in the center of my chest happened a few years later. I was living in a tiny, miserable studio apartment miles away from campus that I could barely afford. It was the dead of winter, and the heating unit had completely broken down. I was wrapped tightly in 2 heavy winter jackets, leaning aggressively over a chipped wooden desk, desperately trying to revise a complex floor plan for a duplex I was hoping to renovate. Past due utility bills were spread out across the table like a bad hand of cards, and rent reminders were constantly blinking on my cracked phone screen. The isolation was crushing. I broke my own rule and called my dad. I did not want to ask for money. I swear I did not. I just wanted some basic fatherly advice. I just wanted to hear my father tell me I was going to be okay. When he finally answered the phone, he sounded deeply annoyed. I quietly told him about my massive struggles with the real estate design course. I told him I was feeling overwhelmed and scared about the future. He sighed heavily into the receiver, a sound dripping with absolute disappointment. Real estate is an aggressive game for men who understand numbers and leverage, Arthur, he said coldly. You do not have the stomach for it. You should try to find something significantly safer. Go get a quiet desk job with a basic salary somewhere. And then, without waiting for my response, he hung up the phone. I sat alone in the freezing dark. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. I looked down at my cheap black leather portfolio, the one holding all my intricate architectural designs. The side stitching had just torn wide open, the cheap synthetic thread finally giving way under the pressure of holding too many oversized blueprints. I did not cry. Crying was a useless luxury I simply could not afford. Instead, I dug through a drawer and found a heavy needle and some thick industrial thread. I sat directly under the weak, flickering yellow light of my desk lamp and viciously sewed that portfolio shut by hand. Every single time I pushed the sharp needle through the tough, unyielding fabric, my frozen hands shook violently. But with every single stitch, I was sealing away my pathetic need for their approval. That ugly, crooked portfolio became my personal armor. It became the only thing that stayed with me through every single brutal project afterward. And then came the ultimate breaking point. Graduation day. I was graduating at the very top of my architecture and development class. I had proudly mailed them the premium reserve tickets 3 months in advance. I had confirmed the start time multiple times. When my name finally echoed loudly through the massive stadium, the applause rose around me like a massive wave. I walked slowly across the grand stage, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I turned my head toward the VIP family section. I looked frantically for the row of 8 premium chairs with little white reserved cards showing my last name. All 8 chairs were completely empty. There was no sudden medical emergency. There was no tragic traffic accident holding them up. They had not forgotten the date. They had simply chosen not to come. I found out exactly why later that afternoon. I was sitting entirely alone in my cramped apartment, eating a cold turkey sandwich while still wearing my graduation gown, when I mindlessly opened social media. Julian had posted a new photo. It was a picture of him casually leaning against the hood of a brand new, gleaming silver Porsche. My parents were standing right next to him, beaming with an overwhelming pride I had never once seen directed at me. The arrogant caption read, "Early promotion gift. Thanks Mom and Dad for always believing in me." They skipped my graduation ceremony to go to a luxury car dealership and buy a high-end sports car for the son who had never actually finished a single thing he started in his entire life. That was the exact day the last fraying string connecting me to that family violently snapped. I understood exactly where I stood. I did not call them to scream. I did not text them to demand a pathetic apology. I just packed up my entire life, changed my phone number, and quietly disappeared into the concrete machinery of the city. I was entirely ready to build my own empire in the silence they left behind, but I honestly did not know that the ultimate test of my resolve was already waiting for me just over the horizon. 8 extremely long months slipped by after that humiliating graduation ceremony. They were quiet, brutally clean months where absolutely no one in that house said my name unless they actively needed to compare it to someone else's failures. I aggressively threw myself into the unforgiving Seattle real estate market with a terrifying level of ambition that my father confidently claimed I did not possess. I started incredibly small. I acted as my own general contractor, designer, and project manager on neglected properties no one else wanted. I saved every single dollar. I skipped meals. I signed binding legal contracts on the hoods of dusty pickup trucks in the freezing rain. And I absolutely did not tell a single soul in my family about any of my growing success. Silence felt significantly safer than offering them something beautiful that they could just carelessly overlook or destroy again. During that grueling time, I met a man named Marcus. Marcus was a veteran commercial real estate developer, a tough, deeply cynical guy in his late 60s who saw exactly how I looked at broken buildings. He saw the fire in me that my own father had tried to extinguish. Marcus became the strict mentor my father never was. Under Marcus's aggressive guidance, I took the absolute biggest financial risk of my entire life. I pooled every single cent I had saved, took on massive, terrifying commercial debt, and purchased a completely ruined, historic top-floor warehouse space right in the bustling heart of downtown Seattle. For 6 straight months, I barely slept more than 3 hours a night. I physically rebuilt that massive space inch by grueling inch. I poured my own blood, sweat, and rage into the foundation of that property. When it was finally finished, it was not just a luxury apartment. It was an architectural masterpiece. It was a stunning $5 million penthouse featuring panoramic, unobstructed floor-to-ceiling views of the entire city skyline. I officially listed the property, and within 48 hours, it sparked an incredibly vicious bidding war among wealthy tech CEOs and foreign investors. Then, the media actively caught wind of the story. The largest and most respected real estate journal in the Pacific Northwest ran a massive multi-page feature. The headline was impossible to miss. Local developer's $5 million penthouse makes real estate headlines. Right underneath that bold, aggressive text was my name printed in black ink. Arthur Mitchell. The incredibly detailed article listed all the financial numbers, the strict timelines, the entire grueling renovation process, and the massive projected returns. It even featured a direct quote from Mr. Sterling, a famous local billionaire, praising my innovative vision. My phone started buzzing violently and constantly with links, emails, and loud congratulations from industry colleagues and wealthy players I barely remembered meeting. But absolutely none of those messages were from my family. I was sitting in my old Honda parked outside a dusty, active job site late one afternoon, letting the engine hum under my tired hand while I thoroughly reviewed a heavily revised valuation sheet. A new notification suddenly slid directly across my cracked screen. It was an article forwarded from an old college acquaintance named Leo. I opened the link without actually thinking. There it was. My face, my building, my triumph. I set the phone face down onto the passenger seat, staring blankly through the dirty windshield as the heavy late afternoon clouds slowly pulled over the gloomy sky. For a very long moment, I honestly did not feel proud, and I certainly did not feel relieved. I just felt completely still, like the entire world had paused on its axis just to see what I would do next. Then the phone violently vibrated again. This time, the name glowing brightly on the screen was not a business colleague. It was not a reporter. It was my father. After 8 months of absolute, suffocating dead silence, after willingly missing my graduation to buy a car, after pretending I literally did not exist on this earth, he finally reached out. The message was painfully short, incredibly direct, and written exactly in his typical commanding tone. No warm greeting, no softness, no "how have you been?" No congratulations on making millions of dollars. Family dinner at 6 p.m. important discussion. Just a cold, sterile summons. Another text message immediately followed the first one. Don't be late. I slowly picked up the phone and held it tightly between my stiff fingers, deeply feeling the heavy weight of 8 silent, agonizing months pressing right through the cold glass screen. I knew exactly what had happened. Leo, motivated by petty jealousy over my sudden massive success, had undoubtedly screenshotted the article and forwarded it directly to my father with some snarky comment. My family saw the massive dollar signs suddenly attached to my previously worthless name, and instantly, the invisible son was strictly required to report back to base. This was absolutely not a warm family reunion. It was a calculated financial transaction poorly dressed up as family bonding. I did not breathe for a long moment. The sheer audacity of the demand was breathtaking. They wanted me to bail them out. I knew it instantly. Julian had likely run his fake corporate promotion straight into the ground. The massive monthly Porsche payments were probably drowning them in debt, and they desperately needed their reliable gap filler to pry open his heavy wallet. In the distant past, this is exactly where I would have panicked. This is exactly where the deep childhood programming would have violently kicked in, making me feel overwhelming guilt, making me pathetically wonder if buying their love and respect was finally possible. But sitting right there in that cold car, staring out at the towering city skyline that I was rapidly beginning to own, I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt a cold, surgical precision settling deep into my bones. I inhaled once deeply through my nose, let my tense shoulders physically settle, and slowly typed the absolute only answer that man deserved. "I'll be there." I dropped the phone back onto the empty passenger seat, aggressively started the car engine again, and quietly watched the city streetlights flicker to life as the dark sky heavily shifted toward the evening. Whatever they greedily wanted from me tonight, they had already shown me something significantly more important. They only remembered my existence when the rest of the world finally did. I was going to give them a masterclass in aggressive real estate, and it was going to cost them everything. I just needed to make one very specific stop before I went to dinner. The arrogant text message stayed glowing on my phone screen long after the Honda's engine stopped rumbling beneath me. But I absolutely did not drive straight to my parents' house. Not yet. Instead, I aggressively turned the steering wheel and pulled into the small, private, secured parking lot sitting directly behind my downtown office building. It was a completely hidden place that absolutely no one from my toxic family had ever bothered to visit or even ask about. The heavy sky was sinking fast into that deep bluish-gray color that always made the city of Seattle feel significantly quieter than it actually was. I locked my car doors, rapidly climbed the back concrete stairs, and let the heavy, thick glass door loudly close behind me. Once inside my office, the familiar, low hum of the overhead fluorescent lights immediately settled deep into my tired bones. I walked directly over to my large mahogany desk and gently set down my old black portfolio. The exact same cheap leather one I had desperately stitched by hand years before in that freezing apartment. The thick, crooked seam was still prominently there in the corner, a constant, physical reminder of a terribly lonely night I had spent telling myself that one day I would actually have something incredibly valuable worth putting inside it. I opened the flap slowly. Thick paper brushed against thick paper. Stacks of highly confidential contracts, complex property valuations, dense financial spreadsheets, and detailed progress reports. My entire adult life was perfectly organized in blue ink signatures and stamped dates. Not a single sheet of paper in that entire office owed absolutely anything to my family. I did not feel an ounce of burning anger. I did not feel triumphantly happy either. I just felt incredibly precise. I turned on my secure laptop, and the dark room quickly filled with the soft whirring of the cooling fan. My fingers moved rapidly and automatically across the keyboard, double-checking the master project ledger, thoroughly reviewing the outgoing wire payments, and highlighting the specific line items that would legally close in the next 6 weeks. Hard financial numbers steadied my racing heart in a permanent way that actual human beings never ever had. At exactly 6:42 p.m., I stood up and confidently crossed the room to the massive, long window directly overlooking the busy city. The towering corporate building across the street had already turned on its bright interior lights, making its glass facade glow in a soft, powerful amber grid. My own reflection hovered right there in the glass. My tailored blazer was heavily creased from a brutal day of work. My hair was tied back, and absolute exhaustion was visibly sharpening my jawline. It was a hardened face that had aggressively earned every single inch of that $5 million penthouse the news article had just mentioned. I stood there and quietly watched my own reflection breathe. I had not taken a moment to do that in a very long time. My phone vibrated violently on the desk. Another message. Not from my father this time. It was a prominent partner from a massive law firm downtown wanting to formally congratulate me on the penthouse sale. I just let it buzz. 10 seconds later, another message popped up. A journalist requesting a direct quote for a follow-up story. My phone rapidly became a nervous, shaking animal rattling loudly across the smooth wood. I reached over, flipped the device face down, and aggressively turned off the sound. Total silence returned to the room. This pure silence was what actually mattered, not their desperate, greedy noise. My grand plan was already deep in motion. I sat back down in my leather chair and slowly pulled out the massive, heavy acquisition file I had just officially finalized with my broker that very morning. It was the master file for the massive commercial plaza that had taken 4 grueling months of secret, intense negotiations, dozens of disguised site visits, and far too many late-night conference calls with aggressive city inspectors. It was, without any question, the most financially important purchase I had ever legally made in my life. It also certainly was not lost on me that this specific commercial plaza was the absolute key piece of almost every single major development plan in that entire city district. Seattle real estate is an incredibly small, vicious world. You hear very important things when you just work quietly, when you strictly refuse to brag about your money, when you keep your head down and actually listen to the whispers in the broker offices. I knew for an absolute fact that my father and Julian had formed a desperate LLC to build a massive warehouse district redevelopment. They had leveraged their house. They had taken on terrible debt. But the city zoning board required an anchor property to approve the massive permits. The commercial plaza I just bought was that exact anchor property. I slowly ran my fingers along the sharp edge of the final, legally binding signed page, gently tracing the dark blue ink I had aggressively pressed into it only hours earlier. They desperately wanted me at that dinner tonight. They needed something massive from me. They needed me to hand over my new fortune to secure this exact plaza so Julian could play CEO. I firmly slid the entire thick legal packet right into the beat-up black portfolio, pressing it completely flat with the heavy palm of my hand. The physical action felt exactly like slamming a heavy steel door shut on a prison cell. By the time my digital office clock loudly blinked to 7:19 p.m., the large windows had entirely faded into a deep, pitch-black navy. I confidently reached for my expensive winter coat, then immediately stopped. The coat felt entirely unnecessary tonight, too soft, too personal. I left it hanging on the chair and walked right out of the office with absolutely nothing but the battered portfolio gripped tightly in my hand. Outside, my old faded Honda was quietly waiting, its heavily chipped paint catching what very little street light it possibly could. I unlocked the squeaky door, carefully placed the loaded portfolio in the passenger seat, and slid aggressively behind the wheel. As I rapidly pulled onto the busy freeway, the massive city spread out directly ahead of me like a glowing map I had already perfectly memorized. I intentionally drove past the giant buildings I had personally renovated, past the exact street corners where I had once stood shivering, desperately waiting for public buses because my family strictly refused to ever pick me up. I drove past the long bridge where I had exhaustedly walked home more times than I ever wanted to remember. Every single landmark outside my window felt like a vicious tally mark. Here is exactly where they were not, and here is exactly where I forcefully learned how to survive without them. The portfolio lay completely still beside me in the dark. I reached over and gently brushed my fingers against the thick, crooked stitched seam. I absolutely did not rehearse what I would say at this dinner. Words had never actually worked with these people. They always violently talked over my apologies, talked aggressively past my logical explanations, and talked right through every single emotional boundary I had ever desperately tried to draw. So, I stopped trying to use words. This time, I absolutely would not bring my anger. I would not bring my tears or my explanations. I was bringing undeniable, legally binding proof. When I finally reached the sharp turn toward my parents' wealthy, gated neighborhood, I slowly eased off the gas pedal and slowed the car. The massive, identical houses lined the pristine street like quiet, incredibly well-behaved witnesses. Expensive porch lights loudly clicked on as the last bit of sun disappeared completely behind the steep hill. I aggressively pulled my car right into their spotless driveway. My father would certainly appreciate the strict punctuality. The massive house glowed in that incredibly familiar, heavy gold light. Through the expensive dining room window, I could clearly see their dark silhouettes rapidly moving around. Julian gesturing wildly, my dad pacing nervously. None of them had absolutely any idea what kind of financial nuclear bomb was currently sitting in the passenger seat of my old Honda. I opened the car door, stepped out into the freezing night, and aggressively adjusted the stiff collar of my blazer. One very slow breath in, one incredibly steady breath out. They demanded an important discussion tonight. Fine. I had something extremely important to discuss, too. The heavy oak front door swung open on its perfectly oiled hinges before my knuckles could even make contact with the polished brass knocker. My father stood there, perfectly filling the massive doorframe like a security guard blocking the entrance to a corporate bank vault. His broad shoulders were squared, his posture flawlessly rigid, and he was wearing a crisp, perfectly ironed blue button-down shirt tucked neatly into expensive slacks. He looked exactly like a powerful, wealthy man greeting an exceptionally important corporate client, rather than a son he had aggressively ignored, neglected, and emotionally abused for nearly a year. The tense, suffocating atmosphere bleeding out from the bright hallway felt significantly heavier than the air at a closed-casket funeral, but he expertly masked it with a completely terrifying, highly practiced smile. "Arthur, you are right on time," he said, taking one measured step aside to officially allow me to enter his domain. There was absolutely no hug. There was no warm handshake. There was no fatherly pat on the back. There was only his blatant, calculated approval for my strict punctuality. In his rigid, money-driven world, time was always money, and he expected absolutely everyone around him to operate strictly on his exact clock or face severe consequences. I stepped carefully over the polished marble threshold, my heavily worn black leather portfolio gripped tightly in my right hand. The massive suburban house smelled exactly the same as it did when I was a terrified teenager desperately trying to become completely invisible to avoid their wrath. It was that overwhelming, distinct mixture of expensive lemon furniture polish, the rich, savory scent of a roasting beef tenderloin emanating from the gourmet kitchen, and my mother's suffocating, heavy floral perfume that always gave me a massive headache. I walked slowly down the long, brightly lit hallway toward the formal dining room, my heavy leather work boots making absolutely no sound on the thick, expensive Persian rug that ran the entire length of the corridor. When I finally turned the corner into the dining room, the entire cast of toxic characters was already fully assembled and eagerly waiting for their designated prey to officially arrive. The massive mahogany dining room table was meticulously set with the fine, gold-rimmed china they exclusively brought out for major holidays, or when they desperately needed to deeply impress someone with money. My mother, Evelyn, hovered nervously behind her high-backed, heavily upholstered chair. She wore a forced, incredibly fragile smile that looked like it was actively causing her severe physical pain to maintain. She was constantly wringing her hands together, the heavy diamond rings on her fingers catching the bright light of the crystal chandelier hanging directly above the table. My older brother, Julian, was sitting comfortably right next to the head of the table, claiming his usual spot as the undisputed golden child. He was leaning far back in his chair, lazily swirling a large glass of expensive dark red wine. He had the exact same arrogant, highly punchable smirk on his face, looking exactly like a man who had already won the state lottery and was just impatiently waiting to collect his massive check. Sitting quietly and uncomfortably next to him was his new wife, Sarah. They had eloped in a highly rushed, deeply chaotic Vegas ceremony a few months ago. It was a reckless, poorly planned marriage that absolutely everyone in our wealthy social circle already confidently knew was heading rapidly toward a very messy, highly publicized divorce and a vicious battle over assets. And rounding out this absolute nightmare of a family gathering was my Aunt Clara, the family's ultimate silent manipulator. She was sitting perfectly upright, her posture absolutely immaculate, with her hands folded neatly on the table, watching my every single move with cold, highly calculating eyes. "Arthur, sweetheart," my mother cooed loudly, suddenly rushing forward to place a delicate, perfectly manicured hand directly on my arm. "We have missed you so incredibly much. Just look at you. You look so handsome, so grown up and successful. We are just so incredibly proud of everything you have accomplished lately. We saw the incredible news about your massive real estate promotion." I slowly looked down at her hand resting lightly on my dark blazer sleeve. I did not violently pull away. I did not flinch or show any outward sign of the deep, physical disgust currently churning in my stomach. I just stared blankly and silently at her fingers until she slowly, awkwardly retracted them, clearly sensing the absolute freezing cold radiating from my body. "Let's just sit down," I said quietly, my voice completely devoid of any recognizable emotion or warmth. I walked right past her and confidently took the absolutely only empty seat currently available in the room. It was located at the absolute farthest end of the incredibly long mahogany table. It was the exact same chair I had always been permanently relegated to during every Thanksgiving dinner, every Christmas morning, every forced family gathering. It was the designated, isolated space specifically reserved for the invisible gap filler. I gently placed my battered, hand-stitched black leather portfolio directly onto the polished wood, right next to my pristine white dinner plate. Aunt Clara immediately eyed the scarred, ugly leather with deep, visible disgust, her upper lip curling slightly in judgment before she quickly composed her face back into a polite mask. My father confidently took his rightful place at the absolute head of the table. He did not waste a single second asking about my health, my mental state, or my life over the past 8 months. He aggressively cleared his throat, picked up his heavy crystal water glass, tapped it lightly with his index finger to command the room's attention, and leaned forward. "Let's get straight to business, shall we?" my father announced, his deep voice carrying an undeniable tone of absolute authority. "Arthur, we all saw the massive feature article about you in the Commercial Real Estate Journal this morning. I must admit we were quite surprised. You have somehow managed to scrape together a very decent little financial win for yourself. But building and flipping a single luxury penthouse is essentially child's play compared to the massive corporate projects we are currently working on here." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly and casually in my lap. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not try to justify the endless sleepless nights, the brutal negotiations, or the literal blood I had poured into that beautiful penthouse. I just let him keep aggressively digging his own massive financial grave. Julian scoffed loudly from across the table, taking another incredibly large gulp of his dark red wine. "Yeah, little brother. Flipping a single pretty apartment is cute. It's a nice little salary bump for a beginner trying to play the game. But the big leagues are a completely different, utterly ruthless animal. You need massive vision. You need aggressive financial leverage. You need real, undeniable power to play at our current corporate level." "Exactly." My father agreed smoothly, completely ignoring Julian's blatant disrespect toward me. "Which brings us directly to exactly why we urgently asked you to join us here tonight for this dinner. Our family currently has a massive, unprecedented financial opportunity sitting right on this table. Julian and I have officially formed a highly exclusive development LLC. We are currently in the final stages of securing a massive, multi-million-dollar warehouse district redevelopment project. It is a mega project that is going to completely change the entire economic skyline of this city. We already have the brilliant architectural plans drawn up, we have the aggressive construction teams on standby, and we have the deep political connections within the city zoning board." My mother leaned forward across the table, her eyes wide and suddenly glistening with fake, highly practiced tears. "It is an incredibly rare chance for us to finally build a massive, lasting family legacy, Arthur. It is a chance to build something incredibly beautiful that your grandparents would have been so incredibly proud of before they passed away. Think of the massive inheritance we can leave for the next generation." The sheer, unadulterated manipulation was absolutely breathtaking. They were actively, shamelessly using the sacred memory of the exact same grandparents whose inheritance they had selfishly and aggressively drained years ago to successfully fund Julian's completely failed speedboat venture. I looked directly into my father's greedy, desperate eyes. "If you already have the brilliant architectural plans and the deep political connections, what exactly do you desperately need from me tonight?" My father smiled broadly. It was a cold, incredibly predatory stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes at all. "We need immediate liquid capital to finally cross the finish line. The city zoning board is playing terrible hardball with the final construction permits. We absolutely need to legally secure the massive commercial plaza located directly in the exact center of the district. It is the absolute anchor property. If we successfully buy the plaza, the city immediately approves the zoning. If the city approves the zoning, our major corporate investors instantly wire the massive funds to our accounts. We are offering you a very rare, highly exclusive chance to come in right now as a silent financial partner. You provide the immediate funding from your recent massive penthouse sale, and we will expertly and aggressively guide the project to completion. Everyone wins. We all get incredibly rich. Julian leaned heavily across the table, his eyes narrowing greedily as he looked at me. It is a very generous offer, honestly, considering how incredibly new and inexperienced you are to the brutal world of high-stakes commercial real estate. You would actually get to sit back, invest your money securely with us, and quietly learn from our real, proven corporate experience. I sat there in the heavy silence, fully digesting the absolute audacity of their pitch. They desperately wanted my money. They wanted every single dime I had bled for, starved for, and violently fought for over the last 8 grueling months. They wanted me to completely drain my bank accounts to aggressively buy the property for them, just so they could immediately take absolute control, claim the massive capital gains, slap Julian's undeserving name in giant letters on the building, and confidently leave me sitting alone in the dark once again. They fully expected me to fall right back into line like a well-trained dog. They expected the terrified, desperate kid who just wanted his family to finally love him to open his wallet and buy their temporary affection. But that desperate, lonely kid officially died on graduation day while helplessly staring at 8 completely empty chairs. I slowly looked around the table. I analyzed Julian's smug, deeply punchable face. I noticed Sarah's deeply uncomfortable shifting in her chair. I met Aunt Clara's cold, calculating stare. I saw through my mother's fake, manipulative tears. And I stared directly into my father's greedy, wildly expectant eyes. The silence in the room stretched out, tight and incredibly heavy, exactly like a rubber band pulled right to the absolute breaking point. I slowly reached out, placing my right hand firmly on top of my battered black portfolio. A family partnership, I repeated quietly, my voice perfectly steady, letting the specific, loaded words hang suspended in the still, tense air of the formal dining room. Exactly. My father nodded vigorously, his eyes lighting up brightly as he mistakenly sensed what he thought was my typical pathetic hesitation. We confidently pool our vast financial resources. We aggressively protect each other from the outside world and the ruthless market. That is exactly how wealthy, powerful families successfully build generational power and unstoppable wealth. I locked my eyes directly onto my father's face, refusing to blink. A family shows up, Richard. A family does not intentionally skip a college graduation ceremony to go to a luxury car dealership and buy a brand new sports car. A family does not secretly steal an entire college fund just to buy a useless speedboat. A family absolutely does not take a minimum wage salary explicitly meant for drafting tools just to pay a high-priced lawyer for a reckless lawsuit caused by a golden child who refuses to grow up. The temperature in the massive dining room instantly plummeted to freezing. Julian violently slammed his heavy crystal wine glass directly down onto the table. The dark red liquid splashed aggressively over the rim, heavily staining my mother's pristine white, imported linen tablecloth. Are you seriously still crying about that stupid, meaningless graduation ceremony? Julian snapped aggressively, his face rapidly flushing a dark, angry red. Grow the hell up, Arthur. We were incredibly busy with actual adult corporate matters. You are sitting here stubbornly holding a pathetic grudge like a literal, crying child, while we are actively offering you a multi-million-dollar corporate business deal that you absolutely do not even deserve. My mother gasped loudly, bringing a trembling napkin directly to her mouth. Arthur, please, I am begging you, do not ruin this incredibly beautiful evening. We are actively trying to heal our relationship and move forward as a united family. I am absolutely not ruining anything, Mother, I said, my voice completely devoid of any anger, sadness, or vindictiveness. It was entirely flat, cold, and absolute. It was the precise voice of a man conducting a hostile corporate takeover. I did, in fact, come here tonight for an extremely important discussion. Just not yours. My father deeply frowned, the fake, predatory smile completely vanishing from his face in an instant, replaced by a dark scowl. Arthur, we do not have the time or the endless patience for your typical, exhausting dramatics. Are you going to act like a real man? Write the massive check, and legally join this highly profitable project? Or are you going to walk out that door? I did not answer him verbally. Instead, I calmly moved my hands to the heavy brass clasp of my battered black portfolio. The sharp, metallic click echoed incredibly loudly in the perfectly silent room. I slowly opened the severely worn, hand-stitched leather cover. Sitting neatly inside was the thick, meticulously organized stack of heavy legal documents. I pulled the entire packet out and placed it directly into the absolute center of the dining room table, right under the bright, unforgiving glare of the expensive crystal chandelier. Aunt Clara leaned far forward, her sharp eyes darting nervously toward the thick, official-looking papers bearing government seals. Julian scoffed loudly again, though the sound was noticeably slightly weaker this time. What exactly is that garbage? Are you seriously trying to show us your little amateur architectural blueprints again? We do not care about your little drawings, Arthur. We are talking about millions of dollars here. That, I said, pointing a single, steady finger directly at the top page of the massive stack, is the fully executed, legally binding commercial deed of sale. My father stared blankly at the documents, his thick brow furrowed in deep, genuine confusion. Deed of sale for what specific property? The commercial plaza, I replied smoothly, watching the exact muscles in his face very carefully. The exact anchor property located directly in the absolute center of the warehouse district. The exact same property you just told me you desperately needed to secure your massive city zoning permits. The absolute silence that immediately followed was utterly deafening. It was a thick, suffocating, terrifying vacuum that aggressively sucked every single ounce of breathable air straight out of the dining room. My father inhaled incredibly sharply, making a ragged, wet sound in the back of his throat. You are completely exaggerating, Arthur. That is impossible. That massive property is tightly tied up in a complex family trust. It is absolutely not even publicly available on the open real estate market. It was available privately exactly 4 months ago. I corrected him, my cold voice cutting right through the tense air like a surgical scalpel cutting through flesh. The seller happily accepted my aggressive, all-cash premium offer early this morning. I bypassed the complicated trust completely by utilizing direct leverage through my own LLC. The official deed was officially recorded and stamped with the city clerk at exactly 3 p.m. today. You can gladly read the public registry yourself tomorrow morning. I aggressively pushed the heavy stack of legal documents directly across the polished wood. The glossy, heavy pages reflected the bright overhead lights. My father reached out with visibly, violently trembling fingers. He slowly pulled the top page toward him. His wide, terrified eyes aggressively darted back and forth across the dense, unforgiving legal text. He saw the official blue city stamps. He saw the massive, multimillion-dollar purchase price. And finally, his eyes landed on my signature, perfectly and confidently executed at the absolute bottom of the page. All the blood instantly drained out of my father's face, leaving him looking exactly like a sick, elderly ghost. The heavy muscle in his jaw clenched so incredibly tightly I thought his teeth would literally shatter inside his mouth. Julian's chair violently creaked as he aggressively shifted his weight. Dad? What is it? What the hell does it actually say? My father could not even speak. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish out of water. He just dropped the heavy paper back onto the table as if it had physically burned his skin. Julian aggressively snatched the paper up. He rapidly read it. His arrogant, confident smirk completely melted off his face in less than a second, instantly replaced by a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. You actually bought it? Julian whispered, his voice cracking horribly in the quiet room. You bought the entire commercial plaza? I nodded exactly once, a slow, deliberate movement. Yes, Julian. I own the entire footprint. I own the buildings, the parking lots, and the dirt underneath it, which legally means your precious, highly leveraged warehouse district redevelopment project currently has absolutely zero anchor property. And without that anchor property, The city will absolutely deny your massive zoning request. Without the zoning request, your major corporate investors are going to violently pull their massive funding. Your project is dead. It is legally, financially, and permanently dead. My mother let out a loud, pathetic, wailing sob, violently burying her face completely in her trembling hands. Aunt Clara stared directly at me with her mouth hanging wide open in pure, unfiltered shock, her perfect posture finally crumbling. My father finally found his stolen voice. He gripped the edge of the mahogany dining table so incredibly hard his knuckles turned completely white. Why would you ever do this? You deliberately knew we were aggressively going after that exact land. You intentionally, maliciously sabotaged your own flesh and blood. No, Richard. I corrected him calmly, absolutely refusing to raise my voice to match his rising panic. I simply knew the city was going after it. And unlike you, I actually do the incredibly hard work. I do not sit around a fancy dining table aggressively waiting for naive, desperate people to blindly hand me their hard-earned money. You wanted a family partnership tonight, but you never actually wanted a real partner. You just wanted an obedient wallet you could aggressively drain until it was empty. Arthur, please! My mother cried out, aggressively reaching across the table with trembling, desperate hands. We are supposed to be a family. You absolutely cannot do this to us. Your father recklessly took out massive, high-interest bridge loans against this very house just to fund the initial architectural plans. If those corporate investors pull out tomorrow, the bank will absolutely foreclose on this house. We will be homeless. Julian will be entirely ruined. Julian is a grown man, I said coldly, looking directly at my older brother, who was now visibly sweating profusely and staring blankly at the wall like a trapped animal. He can finally figure it out himself. Or maybe you can just sell his shiny silver Porsche to help cover the massive lawyer fees he is about to need when the investors sue him. I slowly, deliberately stood up from my chair. I reached calmly across the table, gathered my perfectly executed legal documents, and slid them perfectly back into the battered black portfolio. I closed the leather flap with a soft, incredibly final click. You aggressively texted me demanding an important discussion tonight, I said, looking down at the utterly broken, terrified people sitting frozen around the table. This was it. Dinner is all yours. Enjoy the roast. But the future, that belongs strictly to me. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Absolutely no one followed me or even tried to stop me as I turned my back and calmly walked out of that dining room. They just sat there, completely frozen in absolute terror and entirely paralyzed by the massive, unstoppable financial disaster I had just intentionally dropped directly into their laps. The night air felt incredibly sharp and biting when I finally stepped outside onto the large front porch, but I welcomed the freezing cold. It instantly, beautifully cleared the heavy, deeply toxic scent of that house from my lungs. I confidently walked down the concrete path, unlocked the squeaky door of my old Honda, and slid into the familiar driver's seat. Before I could even put the key into the ignition, my phone aggressively buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a frantic, deeply desperate text message from my mother. Arthur, please come back inside right now. We can negotiate this. We did not know how to make things right in the past. Please do not give up on us now. We need you. We will lose everything. I did not type a reply. I did not angrily block the number. I simply turned the phone face down, started the engine, and drove away from that neighborhood, knowing with absolute certainty I would never return. The massive, brutal fallout from that night happened with a terrifying speed that even I had not fully anticipated. The ruthless world of commercial real estate does not offer a single ounce of mercy to reckless people who heavily overleverage themselves on unconfirmed deals. Exactly 2 weeks after our disastrous dinner, The city officially and publicly rejected my father's massive zoning application because he utterly failed to legally secure the required anchor property. The very next morning, his major corporate investors aggressively pulled their funding, issuing highly publicized statements distancing themselves from the LLC. Without that massive influx of investor cash, the crushing, inescapable weight of their high-interest bridge loans immediately collapsed directly onto their heads. My father was fiercely forced to quickly liquidate his entire life savings and completely empty his 401k retirement accounts just to keep the aggressive bank from instantly foreclosing on his house. They survived, but they were financially broken, forced to live quietly on a very strict budget they absolutely despised. But the absolute worst destruction fell directly, and deservedly, onto Julian. 3 months later, I was sitting entirely alone in a quiet, upscale coffee shop near my downtown office, reviewing a new contract, when Julian's wife, Sarah, unexpectedly walked in and sat down directly across from me. She looked absolutely exhausted, like a woman who had not slept in weeks. Deep, dark purple circles heavily bruised the delicate skin under her eyes, and she was nervously twisting her expensive diamond wedding ring around her finger. "Arthur," she started, her voice shaking slightly, her eyes darting around the cafe. "I am so incredibly sorry to bother you here. I did not know where else to go. Nobody else will take my calls." I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee and waited. I did not owe this woman anything, but my quiet silence allowed her the space to finally speak. "Julian is facing a massive, federal lawsuit," Sarah confessed, thick tears suddenly welling up in her eyes. "He lied to the early investors. He aggressively forged some initial environmental reports to illegally secure the early bridge loans before the city denied the zoning. The federal fraud investigators are actively tearing his corporate office apart right now. He is completely, utterly bankrupt, Arthur. The bank repossessed his silver Porsche yesterday right out of the driveway while the neighbors watched. He is completely terrified he is going to federal prison." She looked directly at me with absolutely desperate, pleading eyes, clearly hoping to find the soft, compliant brother Julian used to mock. "Your parents are entirely tapped out. They have absolutely no more cash to give. Aunt Clara is fiercely refusing to answer their phone calls. Julian desperately needs a highly specialized criminal defense lawyer. He needs massive money to stay out of a cell, Arthur. You are the absolute only one left who can help him. He is your brother. Please, you have to save him." I slowly placed my coffee cup down onto the small saucer. I looked intently at this poor, deeply manipulated woman who had blindly married into a family of absolute vultures, entirely unaware of the rot beneath the surface. "Sarah," I said gently, ensuring my calm voice carried absolutely zero malice. "Julian spent his entire adult life being fiercely and violently protected from the natural consequences of his own terrible actions. My parents happily stole my entire college fund and my hard-earned salary meant for drafting tools just to violently shield him from reality. If I write him a massive check today, I am simply continuing the exact same cycle of abuse. I am enabling a criminal. I strongly suggest you find a very aggressive divorce lawyer and completely separate your personal finances from his before the federal investigators legally freeze your bank accounts." 2. Sarah stared at me for a very long, painful moment. She looked into my eyes and finally saw the absolute, unshakable boundary I had built. She realized there was no guilt left to exploit. She quietly nodded, wiped her tears with a napkin, stood up, and walked out of the coffee shop. I never spoke to her again, but I read in the local paper a few weeks later that she officially filed for divorce, seeking full custody of their remaining assets before the feds could seize them. Julian lost his marriage, his luxury cars, his fake corporate title, and eventually, he pleaded guilty to minor wire fraud to avoid major jail time. The golden child finally crashed headfirst into the solid brick wall of reality. Exactly 1 full year has passed since that freezing, explosive night in the dining room. Tonight, I am standing entirely alone on the massive glass balcony of my own luxury penthouse. The cold, crisp autumn wind is aggressively blowing through my hair, but I am perfectly warm. The sprawling, massive city of Seattle stretches out directly below me, An endless, breathtaking ocean of glittering white and gold lights. Down there, millions of people are living their complex lives, fighting their own brutal battles, and navigating their own painful, deeply complicated family dynamics. Sitting directly on the small glass table next to me is that exact same battered, black leather portfolio. The thick, crooked stitching I desperately sewed by hand in that freezing apartment is still holding incredibly strong. I never threw it away. I never replaced it with a sleek, expensive designer briefcase to match my new bank account. It remains my constant, physical reminder of exactly where I came from and exactly what I had to violently survive to get here. For the absolute longest time, I genuinely, deeply believed that the heavy silence my family forced upon me was a cruel, highly unfair punishment. I genuinely believed that my forced invisibility was a clear, undeniable sign that I was fundamentally broken, unlovable, and entirely worthless. I spent decades frantically trying to perform for them, trying to blindly earn a seat at a table that was specifically designed to exclude me. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my worth, they would finally see me. But as I stand here tonight, looking out over the massive real estate empire I built entirely with my own two hands, I finally understand the ultimate truth. Their crushing silence was not a punishment at all. It was an absolute gift. Because they completely ignored me, I never learned how to comfortably rely on their deeply toxic safety nets. Because they never rescued me, I was forcefully required to become my own savior. I learned exactly how to aggressively fight in the dark. I learned how to silently build a massive foundation out of solid concrete while Julian was frantically building unstable castles out of thin paper and fragile lies. Setting a permanent, unshakable boundary against your own toxic family is incredibly painful. It goes directly against every single biological instinct we are taught from the exact moment we are born. Society constantly demands that we repeatedly forgive toxic blood relatives simply because we happen to share a similar genetic code. But boundaries are not acts of horrific cruelty. Boundaries are simply quiet, heavy doors that we confidently close so that our own lungs can finally breathe clean air again. I did not completely destroy my family. They destroyed themselves with their own insatiable greed, arrogance, and entitlement. I simply stopped violently destroying myself to aggressively keep them comfortable. The exact moment I officially stopped waiting for an apology that was never, ever going to come, my actual life finally began. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story tonight. It takes massive, undeniable courage to actively walk away from the heavy tables where respect is no longer being served. Always remember that your massive value is absolutely never determined by the highly flawed people who are entirely incapable of seeing it. Have you ever faced something terribly similar with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to violently cut off the people who were supposed to protect you the most? Share your powerful story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.